음. Well, here we are. Welcome. And we'll just put the pre-show on for a second, just to give people a little bit of advance warning that we're about to go live properly. Nice to see so many people in the chat. Good number of new names as well. Welcome, welcome. Please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed to DFA before. We've got a very good, interesting conversation this evening with both the Senator and John Adams on the line, and we'll bring them in a second or two. And a lot of opportunity for you to ask questions. I do encourage you, of course, to use the chat and have a discussion in the chat. But if you specifically want to ask the Senator or John a question, you're welcome to do that through the conversation tonight. So hopefully we'll have some fun as well. And as John was saying, there might be a bit of good, robust debate as well. And I will just give you one quick view of the dogs. As those who follow the show will know, that Luna and Meteor join us every Tuesday evening on the doggy cam. They're sound asleep. They've been out walking today. So I think they're going to be out of it for the rest of the evening. Anyway, I'm going to take the pre-show off. I'm going to run the intro, and then I'll be back and start the show properly. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 17th of January 2023. Martin North from Digital Finance and This here. Great to have you on. Very important show this evening. We're going to talk about some very, very significant issues about debt, how to deal with debt, what caused it, and what policy changes should be wrought ahead. Of course, there are lots of options, lots of opportunities to change things. And yet, on the other hand, some things we don't seem to be able to change. So it'll be a good discussion. Just before I bring the Senator and John Adams in, let me just remind you, we're not providing specific financial legal advice on the channel. Do play nice in the chat room. It's moderated, but also feel free to throw in comments and suggestions. This is as at the 17th of January if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a question, make sure you use that Walk the World. That'll make sure it gets my attention and I can queue it up. I've enabled Super Chat, and that means if you want to get your question to the top of the list, you can do that via Super Chat or indeed make a contribution to what we do. And without further ado, let me bring in the Senator first. Senator, are you there?
Hey, Martin, how are you?
Very good, Senator, and thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us too. Really appreciate it, and I think this is a really important conversation that we're going to have tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I probably think it's the biggest problem facing government, not just here in Australia, but most Western governments, is how do we deal with this very high level of debt in a way that isn't going to bring the economy down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. And John Adams, are you there?
I'm here, Martin. How are you tonight?
Yeah, very good. And we should explain, John, that you're going to be on audio only. I do have a beauty picture of John Adams that we can put up, though. So when you're speaking, John, we can look at your picture.
Fantastic.
And great to have you on the channel and on the show tonight. So I guess what I think we want to do to start with is to just ask this question. I think we can all agree on one point, and that is we have significant amounts of debt. Globally we do, but in Australia we do. We have huge private debt through mortgages and elsewhere. We have huge government debt. We've got huge international debt. And the debt burden that we are now carrying is being made more intense by the interest rate rises that are now coming through. So while credit was cheap, it's no longer cheap. And so this is really creating a significant pressure point for us. And I guess the first question, and Senator, I'll come to you first, I think, is where did the debt come from? And was it deliberate or was it a happenstance?
Oh, Martin, in regards to motive, one of the first things I was told in the Senate is never to impute motive. But since you asked, it's hard to speculate that when the central banks lowered the interest rates to such a ridiculously low level that they just deliberately ignored the well-known consequences. This isn't an unintended consequence type situation we're in here. It should have been well known when they lowered interest rates, and prior to COVID, mind you. but obviously COVID, they decided to practically lower it to zero. Here in Australia, at least, the Federal Reserve already done a pretty good job of almost getting it to zero before COVID. They must have known. And then, of course, they've been on a incredibly reckless expansionary policy program, certainly in the States. Here we printed $300 billion because of COVID, but the States have been, I think they had $10 trillion in debt around the time of the GFC. They're up to $30 trillion now. Conversations must have been had in these meetings, or if they weren't had, they should have been had, as to what are we setting ourselves up for, what are we setting our children up for in the future if we're engaging in these reckless quantitative and qualitative easing programs. So while I won't impute motive, I will definitely say it was very reckless, given that these so-called experts, I'm led to believe the Federal Reserve has something like 400 PhDs, people, there's people with 400 people there with PhDs at the Federal Reserve, and yet they've allowed this to happen. So where did it come from? Well, obviously credit is an arbitrary construct, and it's important to note that there is two types of credit, and I discussed this earlier with you offline, and people often forget that, is that you actually have debt and equity. And one of the things that really arcs me up in this country is that when I hear politicians say we've always relied on foreign debt, or foreign capital, sorry, I should say, and I often, reply to these people when they say that. I'll say, well, what is capital? And they'll often pause and I'll say, well, there's only two types of it. And it's a rhetorical question, so I'll answer my own question. There's debt and equity. And as a sovereign country, we already have title over our natural wealth. And, if we look at capital through the eyes of a legal sense instead of a financial sense, debt is a mortgage, equity is title. And for the life of me, I do not know why governments allow our untapped wealth, which we have title over, to be sold off or exchanged for a mortgage that imposes a cost on future generations. And, if we take it one step further when it comes to debt, you can have secured debt when you can have unsecured debt. By all means, printing money in an unsecured manner is obviously reckless and is not the right thing to do. However, for a government to secure the debt, or as I like to call it, equity, against a asset that will generate an income greater than the cost of debt, there is nothing wrong with that, provided it's done in a reasonably cautious manner that doesn't overstimulate certain areas of the economy. But yet again, as part of a government and as a sovereign nation, it is the responsibility of governments to provide essential services such as power stations, dams, ports, airports, those monopolistic infrastructure assets that basically can't really have a competitive nature. And as we've seen, sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant here, as we've seen in the last 30 years with the privatisation, and everyone thought that, these so-called monopolistic infrastructure assets will be able to compete in the market. What we've actually ended up with is a conga line of rent seekers, basically looking for government handouts to prop up their inefficient practices. So back to your, initial question, where does debt come from? It's an arbitrary construct, and the question is whether or not you want the government to be in control of it or the private sector. And, it's basically, a public-private partnership whereby, personally, I used to like the way, used to work where the CBA was owned by the taxpayer and owned by the government and people. And then we had three large major banks, as well as a lot more minor banks than what we had now. Many of the minor banks that were around 30 or 40 years ago, building houses, building societies, etc., commercial banks, they've all been pretty much consumed by the big four now. And, we don't really have a competitive market, and it's been very easy for the big banks to just lend. I think they lend something like 60 or 70% now to the housing market, which of course is a form of consumption, albeit, housing is very important. But we really need more funds invested into the productive sector.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I wanted to give you a chance to go off your long run on that, because I know it's a critical issue. And my sense has been for quite some time that the neoliberal philosophy has driven a particular way of thinking about debt. We seem to have pushed a lot of debt into households for the purchase of property, which has pushed property prices up. But if you look at the return that we've actually got in terms of making Australia better, in terms of the infrastructure that we need or the shape of the country that we need, I think we failed pretty remarkably. And this is a 20-year, 30-year problem, I think. So to my mind, it's a structural issue, it's a strategic issue, and it's been made worse, of course, by recent events and post-COVID and those sorts of things. John, do you agree that we've got a debt problem?
Yes, Martin, we have a debt problem. So the answer to your question, where did the debt come from? I would argue it came from Senator Rennick. What I think people need to fully comprehend in terms of where Australia is at the moment is that what happened in the last 3 years is the biggest catastrophe since 1915. And why 1915? Because that's when we basically went through the Gallipoli campaign, and Gallipoli was a complete military disaster. So, Martin, I'm going to take the audience on a bit of a journey. But before I do so, I just want the audience to contemplate the position that many in the UK today believe that Britain's entry into World War One was the downfall of the United Kingdom. Before, in 1914, the UK was the biggest creditor in the world, the biggest lender, and by 1918, it was one of the biggest borrowers. So the war financially destroyed the UK, it destroyed the pound, and obviously it led to the setup of the UK losing the entire empire. And that's how catastrophic World War One was for the United Kingdom. So when we look at where we were prior to COVID, and obviously, Martin, prior to COVID, you and I were doing various YouTube shows talking about private sector debt bubbles, particularly in the housing market. But when we look at what COVID has done and the decisions during the pandemic, so since the beginning of 2020, household debt has gone up, according to the RBA statistics, by $339 billion. And that has created, now that in terms of wealth, that's created $3 trillion worth of wealth, but most of that wealth is just overinflated assets that have no bearing to realistic value. But when you look at public sector debt, basically we have now, in terms of, if we look at, for example, if we look at, say, July 2019, so the beginning of the 1920 financial year pre-COVID, to the forward projections, which is June of 2026, the federal government is going to accumulate $613 billion of additional debt, and the state governments will accumulate, the states and territories combined will accumulate $453 billion over that period of time. So the decision of how we responded to COVID, if we combine the federal and the state territory decisions to combine from the beginning of the pandemic all through to June of 2026, according to all the forecasts the various governments have put out, COVID management will cost government an extra $1 trillion in debt. And so by June of 2026, the Australian government and all the states and territories will owe their creditors $1.88 trillion. And there is no plan to pay that back in terms of public sector debt. And obviously, in terms of the private sector, we have out of control inflation. We have, according to your own statistics, 60% in rental stress, 45% in mortgage stress, and this was all based on the decisions that were made at the beginning of the pandemic. And so if we want to contrast, because Senator Rennick in his opening said something which is going to be the centerpiece of this debate, which is how do we get ourselves out of it? So Senator Rennick made the statement that we want to be able to get out of this debt bubble without bringing down the economy. Now, everyone knows my position on that. There is no way to get out of this debt bubble without bringing the economy down. We have to go through a depression, and we're going to get into that in terms of a second. But if we can just contrast my record versus Senator Rennick's record. So in March of 2020, I knew COVID was not the risk that the government was saying. And I wrote a 6,000-word essay on my website. And Martin, you and I did a 2-part series in April of 2020. And I was against the lockdowns because the in terms of because the what we knew was that the modelling that was coming out of Imperial College in Niall Ferguson was wildly inaccurate because he has one of the worst forecasting records in the history of pandemics. 50% of cases in some of these famous incidents were asymptomatic. So there was a lot of people who had COVID who weren't actually being tested. And then we knew that the PCR test had a 30% false negative rating, which was that 3 out of 10 people who came back and they tested that they didn't have COVID, they actually had COVID. So I knew as early as March 2020 that the risk to human life was not as high as what Morrison, and obviously Morrison is Senator Rennick's leader at the time, in terms of what he was saying. And because on the cost-benefit analysis, because I knew that the risk was not as high as what the government was telling me, I was against the stimulus. Whereas if we look at Senator Rennick's record throughout the course of 2020 and in the first half of 2021, Senator Rennick basically endorsed the stimulus of his government, the Morrison government. He did not criticise the Reserve Bank's decisions in 2020 to cut interest rates and to do quantitative easing, term funding facility, yield curve control, and all the other measures that they had. And so the real question is that so the question is, well, where did the debt come from? The debt, obviously, we had a debt problem prior to COVID, but what we did through COVID, what we did in 2020, is going to be such a monumental disaster. People are going to look back in 20 years' time and compare Australia in 2020, similar to the UK in 1914, and it was a series of politicians in the Parliament who, for whatever reason, and I'm very interested to understand Senator Rennick's thinking of what happened in March and April of 2020. Those decisions, both in fiscal and monetary policy, as well as a range of other policies that were implemented by the Parliament, basically has bankrupted the country and basically led us towards a path of current stagflation. And Martin, you and I did a series of shows in 2020 about stagflation. And if we don't actually get this under control, we are going to repeat the mistakes of the Weimar Republic, and we will see a hyperinflation episode sometime in the next decade.
Okay, John, well, thanks for that. Senator, let you come straight back. So John is basically arguing that the amount of liquidity that was thrown into the economy through COVID is actually a significant part of the problem. It was overdone.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no argument for me on that. I've got some pretty frosty text messages that I sent to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, and Matthias at the time. It would have been a hell of a job, however, notwithstanding, and, I don't want to go into the whole COVID thing. I want a day off from COVID as well, but you can follow my views on COVID on Facebook. But I thought it was overdone. But just I don't want to get into a slap down with John too much, but I was part of Parliament. I'm not a part of the executive. So those decisions were executive decisions. I was told not to fly down the day they passed that monetary bill, and I wasn't happy about that either, because I did oppose the overreaction in the party room backbench meeting. But, politics, as you well know, is I'm one voice, and anyone who's watched my stand on vaccine mandates, I can scream as loud as I like and beat the drum as hard as I can, but I'm still only myself and Alex and Malcolm Roberts and a few others. We're only about 4 or 5 out of the 227 in Parliament. So I do try and call it out. I have called for, if you actually read my maiden speech, quantitative easing in my maiden speech. I have been critical of the RBA continuously throughout my time. So my stance, I call myself a protectionist in my maiden speech. So the fact I do dispute the fact that I never said anything in the first 18 months. If you follow my posts, I was, without going too far down the COVID post, I was calling out the PCR testing and the ivermectin and a lot of the lockdowns, etc. So, but beside, I want to put that aside because I want to talk about the solution.
Yep.
And a little bit about the history. So John goes back to 1915. You mentioned earlier on before, Martin, in the last 30 years, I would actually argue we could go all the way back to 1776. And people often think the American Revolution was because of taxes, without representation. But as Benjamin Franklin, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said this, and I'll stand to be corrected, we would have been happy to pay a little bit of tax had we been able to control our own currency. And what had happened was that the early colonies had established the continental currency, and the foreign banks were constantly flooding the US, the new fledgling US colonies, with fake counterfeit notes, because, as usual, the banks, the big banks, the big end of town, refused to cede control of monetary supply. And the 19th century in the United States is a fascinating period of history in regards to monetary policy. There was always a big struggle between who should control the printing press, whether it be the public sector or the private sector. And of course, Lincoln, I think, got his hands on it for a while. Garfield had a crack at it. They both got shot. Andrew Jackson, I think, shut it down. And it goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson. And ironically enough, the century finished with the book called The Wizard of Oz, which I don't think many people realise is a story about monetary policy. But obviously, the privateers won out in 1913. And interestingly enough, as John pointed out, that also correlates with World War One. And I'm not sure if I haven't looked into the connection between World War One and the start of the Federal Reserve in 1913, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a connection. But it is interesting to note that by the end of 1945, the Bank of England was again nationalised. Before that, it had been a private institution. And of course, what had happened was that after the war, England, despite the fact that they were part of the winning side, got lumped with all the debt. Germany and Japan didn't get lumped with any debt. And England then had to repay the debt. I think it took Great Britain something like 60 years to repay the debt in US dollars. And that was a nice little sleight of hand that basically shifted the power of the centre of the world's monetary supply from the City of London, even though they still, have their finger in the till, over to Washington and the Federal Reserve. I mean, the Federal Reserve is obviously well on its way to controlling the world's money supply by then, but obviously with the Bretton Woods Agreement, the power got shifted, of course, to the Federal Reserve. And so monetary policy is not something new. It's often been a battle between the private and public sector, and it's been going on for centuries in the modern era. It was always a bit harder before paper currency came around because gold was gold, and it was pretty hard to have control of printing gold and silver. But, of course, here we are today. Now, in terms of the way out, John seems to think the only way out is through austerity, and I completely and utterly disagree with that. That is the policy that the RBA is pursuing in other central banks. They are jacking interest rates up too fast, in my view, despite the fact that they lowered them too low. There's two things they should be doing. Number one, in terms of qualitative easing, they should be forecasting, saying, okay, we will lift rates back to 3 or 4%, but we will do it we'll raise it by 0.25% every quarter for the next 3 to 4 years, so i.e. 1% a year for the next 3 to 4 years to bring it up. Because why on earth raise interest rates now when the oil price and everything else is going up? I mean, it's not a counter-cyclical measure. I'm not sure what the opposite of a counter-cyclical measure is, but they're actually fire by, given that, fuel prices are up and the cost of living's going up, why increase interest rates now? I mean, they should have been increasing interest rates in the last decade when inflation was low, when people could have afforded a little bit extra. But the missing piece in all of this is, and I'm sorry if you can't see my hands here, but basically, when you got inflation under control when supply meets demand, right? Now, we've had a demand increase because of the excess monetary printing, spending or whatever from COVID, and a lot of that money got saved and now it's slowly being released. And then we had the supply shock due to the Ukraine war and other measures. And when I say other measures, I'm talking about the general decline in productivity over the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, 3 or 4 decades ago, we didn't, let's put it another way. Today, we've got battalions of academics. We've got battalions of gambling machines. We have battalions of financial engineers. We'll have battalions of baristas. Nothing wrong with baristas. I love my coffee, so we'll leave them out of it. But we have, coming from an accountant perspective, I was a management accountant for a part of my career, and we looked at things like activity-based costing. A lot of the things we do today aren't productive. And, academia, kids delaying their working career by 4 years to go and get a degree that, is basically worthless or useless in any sense of the word. I think we spend $30 billion a year on superannuation for just glorified paper shuffling and money going into the back pockets of the unions and wealth managers. So we really need to, so we've now got this problem where we're not a productive country anymore. We've outsourced all that productivity offshore. We're glorified blowhards, paper shufflers, pen pushers, whatever. And we need to bring back productivity. So rather than have an austerity measure, which is what the RBA is doing. So we've had supply crash, so now the RBA is going to reduce demand as well through austerity. Why not have a productivity measure that increases supply through productivity? And the best way to do that is to have a quantitative easing package, and we can cap it at, say, 2 or 3% of GDP that is focused on building new productive infrastructure like power stations, roads, railways, airports and ports in a productive manner that is going to provide long-term income for the next century. And I'll just give you an example of how much money monopolies can make. Well, let's look at some of the monopolies we sold. We sold CSL, off the top of my head, for about $200 million back in the early 90s. Just in about 3 years ago, we signed a 9-year agreement with CSL for $3.4 billion, or almost $400 million a year, to clean the blood from Red Cross that you donate to Red Cross. So we now pay twice in 1 year what we sold the asset for forever today. CBA, I think we sold for combined over the three tranches about $8 billion. It now makes $10 billion a year. Up here in Queensland, we sold the Port of Brisbane, we sold a 99-year lease on the Port of Brisbane to 6 times earnings. I have no doubt now that the Port of Brisbane probably earns that in a year, and given another 50 years, it'll be earning 5 or 6 times that in just 1 year. In Brisbane, for example, we have 2 million people that live in the city, pay $5 for a toll. In 100 years' time, that'll be 5 million people paying $50 a toll. So why not get a slice of the pie? Now, we were brainwashed at university to say that you can't print money. That is a complete oxymoron. All money is printed. The question is, who's going to print it and what are you going to print it against? Now, if you issue, and this is the thing, companies go out and issue shares all the time, right? They issue new shares and they're going to, they'll either take over another company or for a new mining development. Why can't Australia issue new shares in the form of a bond via an infrastructure bank that's owned by the people? And, we can issue a bond to the state government, the state at 1% for 100 years against an infrastructure asset. The state government has to pay that 1% to the RBA, which is or the infrastructure bank owned by the RBA. They then pay dividends back to the Treasury, and that's a form of generating income for the country. And that is a perfect hedge against inflation as well. And, I know many of you might cringe when I say this, but if you look at the model under the former national government of Joh Peterson here in Queensland, in the late 50s when he was elected, Queensland was broke. And under his brilliant treasurer, young treasurer at the time, Leo Hilscher, they went on a building spree, basically, of, opening up new coal mines, opening up new bauxite deposits, opening up new dams, new roads. I think he opened up more universities state than any other state premier. The way out of this mess is to build. If we all got washed up on a desert island tomorrow, would you go to the bank and get a loan? Of course you wouldn't, because there's no banks on a desert island. You would start building, you would look to control, the supply of essential services and providing essential services. And we have a history of that. This has actually happened here in Australia once before in 1810 when a bloke by the name of Lachlan Macquarie rocked up. In 1805 there was a drought. A lot of the fledgling colony had relied on foreign debt up until that time. That foreign debt was repatriated, so there was no currency, no structure around currency, no understanding of currency, so they started bartering in rum. And, of course, it literally ended tits up in the Rum Rebellion. So Lachlan Macquarie came here and he realised that he was the first governor to see Australia as a potential country, not a colony, and he knows the 3 key things for a country, if you want to be the government controlling that country, is to control your military and your law and order, control your taxation system, control your monetary supply. And he issued the Holy Dollar to build infrastructure, much of which stands in Macquarie Street today in Sydney, the Sydney Barracks and Hospital, for example. And that was how he built the nation. That's how Australia got its start and stabilised. And of course, the sad thing is today that the Holy Dollar is the logo used by Macquarie Bank, and their basically business model is to buy all the infrastructure that was owned by the people, and they clip the ticket as they manage it on behalf of the superannuation funds. That's still 10.5% going on to 12% of our money every week. We were never, and I'll say still because they get to keep it until you're 60 or 65, and there was never an election about that. No one ever asked the people whether or not they wanted to give their money to someone they'd never met until they're 60 or 65 without getting any guarantee they're going to get it back. You talk about vaccine mandates. Well, let me tell you, mate, that was wage theft mandates back in early 1992. Thanks, Paul Keating. You really left this country in a mess with that superannuation and opening up the country to foreign banks in 1985. That was some of the best stuff you've ever done. I mean, we just allowed foreign capital to come in here, or foreign equity come and buy a lot of our assets. And if it didn't get privatised to the superannuation funds, unelected superannuation fund managers, it's now in the hands of foreign ownership. So, I think of Jim Molan, who passed away today. He was always very concerned about national security. And if you want to control your national security, you better control your own national infrastructure.
So it's very interesting, isn't it? Because the two futures are quite different from you, Senator, versus John. Because John is basically saying you got to crash and burn to get out, whereas you're saying no, there's an alternative, which is essentially to invest and build for the future, a la what was done.
Yeah.
But those paths are very different. John, why doesn't what the senators here talking about work in your mind?
Well, I mean, look, thank you very much. I thought I was going to be left out of the debate, so I'm glad that I've been able to rejoin, Martin. But I was just going to say that the senator said in a number of extraordinary statements, which have to be addressed before we get into the solution. So the first thing that the senator said was about what his record is. Well, I've gone through the senator's record extremely carefully, and I've gone through 3 years of Facebook posts, and so I know exactly when the senator's position on this whole issue flipped, and it flipped in June of 2021. So just to give a bit of a contrast in terms of being critical of PCR tests or anything of that nature, on the 10th of June 2020, Senator Rennick introduced a motion in the Senate calling on all members of Parliament to follow the health directives. Now, in June of 2020, I was completely against all the health directives, whereas Senator Rennick's position was that he wanted everyone to follow.
Hang on there. That's not true. I never introduced any motion to...
hang on. No, hang on. I've got the motion. You posted this on the 11th of June 2020, and you said, quote, call on all members of this House and the other players who attended the protest over the weekend, this is the BLM protest, to comply with public health laws and directives. Your motion before the Senate on the 11th of June 2020 was to follow...
wedging Black Lives Matter. Hang on. So there's context to that. That was wedging Black Lives Matter. All those people, there were Labor politicians there at that rally who weren't wearing masks. So they'd been running around telling everyone else to wear masks, and then they turned up at that rally basically not wearing masks. So I was calling out their hypocrisy because it was Graham Perrett and Annika Wells. I remember it now. Okay, because they were carrying on.
Senator, hang on. Look, with all due respect, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So if you can allow me to continue. But here's the thing. What the BLM protest showed was the whole thing was a complete farce. And I knew it was a farce before the BLM protest. The BLM protest basically confirmed that the whole thing was a farce. And your position in front of Parliament was to follow the advice of the chief medical officer and the chief health officers. That's what your motion basically called on all members of Parliament to do.
Well, I have to read the exact words, but I know why I did it. It was to call out their hypocrisy.
Well, I mean, the thing is,
they were virtue signalling over it.
I have the motion right before me. It says, quote, call on members of this House and the other players who attended the protest of the weekend to comply with public health laws and directives. That's a direct quote from your motion.
Yeah, because they were the ones telling everyone else to do it, so I was calling out their hypocrisy.
But the problem is, Senator, that the whole thing was BS to begin with, and yet rather than calling out the BS, you basically said follow. You backed it in. You backed it in all the way in 2020.
No, because John, I had posts pulled down. You go back to I got beat up on the project in March 2021. I had posts pulled down about the PCR testing. I was calling out the lockdowns early 21, and I know I was doing posts against Palaszczuk in late 2020. So, and I said, I forget what I said, but I was going on Sky. I'd have to go through my Sky interviews because I was pushing back on what Palaszczuk was doing up in Queensland with the border closures.
Sure. But hang on. You attacked the Queensland lockdown on the 31st of March 2020, but in 2021. But in 2020, you basically followed your Prime Minister, even though your Prime Minister attempted to put me in jail in 2019 with that ridiculous cash ban. So I was at war, even though I'm a former Liberal and a former Liberal advisor, I was at war with Morrison in 2019 because he was shown to be a draconian. He was a tyrant in 2019 by, this was a world first, trying to put people in jail for using cash. Not even the Europeans were willing to go that far. I don't know, what did we learn in the last, in terms of the last 8 months? He basically had all these secret ministries. I mean, he had power. This was the biggest power.
We'll take that up with Scott Morrison. I mean, I can show you text messages here where I had it out with Scott on numerous occasions and wrote numerous letters to him, text messages, him, Josh, Matthias. I was pushing.
But the problem is, Senator, in that in 2020, when all the critical economic decisions were made in 2020, and in that period of time, there was, other than Martin and I, and you know, if I'm going to be completely accurate, Martin had the opposite position to me. I mean, Martin in April of 2020 was pro-lockdown. I was anti-lockdown, and basically the audience turned on me. So I was against the whole thing at the very start, and I've been consistent all the way through. But the other point I have to say, Martin, is that Senator Rennick said that he was told not to attend Parliament and because of the lockdown and all the procedures that the Parliament had implemented because of the pandemic. Now, here's the reality of this is that there's an act of Parliament. Anyone can look this up. It's called the Parliamentary Privileges Act 1987. It's a criminal offence for anyone to interfere in the conduct or the duties of a member of Parliament. So if Senator Rennick basically told his leadership, screw you all, I'm coming down to Canberra, I'm going to voice my opposition to the stimulus and vote against whatever bill is before the Parliament, no one legally could stop him. So while he was given the order, he followed the order, even though there was no legal effect to that order. So when he said, I was told not to come, I mean, he had every legal right to attend. It was his choice not to attend. And so again, he had the option. And again, so Senator Rennick said that Scott Morrison was in the executive and Senator Rennick is in the legislature. So that is correct, and there is a separation of powers. But even as a lone senator, there have been multiple examples in terms of whether it's in Australian history or in the United States or even in the British House of Commons, where the voice of one person can change the direction of a national debate. And so Senator Rennick had all the opportunity to oppose the RBA, had all the opportunity to oppose Morrison and Frydenberg in terms of the stimulus. But what did he do in 2020? He backed it all in, and that is the accurate record of what happened during COVID-19. So that is obviously a matter of record, a matter of fact as to which people were on which side in that debate, and then obviously we get into the current position. So now we get into in terms of where we go forward from here.
Okay, hang on. So can I just, Martin, have a chance to make a statement on John, because John's obviously more interested in playing the man than the issue. But anyway, let's just go through this. He's right. Everything he said there was right. I guess in March 2020, I'd only been a senator for 9 months. Well, not quite 9 months at that stage. So in the end, I realised you're going to have to do that. And I probably didn't have the confidence in the party room when you're a newbie to, stand up to the leadership. In the end, I did over vaccines and vaccine mandates. And because it all happened so quickly. So everything got shut down on the Friday. The package came out. We were told about the package Sunday night. And then basically I think they flew down on Wednesday to pass it. So it was all sort of, and we didn't know until like literally the day before who was going to go in and who wasn't going to go out. And I should say that I think we were all paired out. So for every one of us that didn't go down because COVID was so scary, they didn't want many people going down there from the risk of spreading COVID. But you're right. And in the end, I've done that much. And, I cop a lot of heat. So why you're attacking me, because I've probably stood up to the party leadership more, probably stood up to Scott Morrison more than any other coalition member for that matter. And, there's a fair chance I'll lose my pre-selection over it, but say la vie, that is what it is. But, yeah, look, that was early days. I was obviously finding my feet and, it was brought on very suddenly. And, these things sometimes, I won't say it did catch me off guard. I think it probably caught everyone off guard. I can well remember that Friday afternoon because the week before Scott Morrison was on Insiders with Brendan Murphy and they were saying, just keep your hands, wash your hands and, stay relaxed. And they were all up in arms saying they were taking it too easy. And Scott had gone to the Cronulla game the night before and they were complaining about that. And we went from the Prime Minister going to a footy match and the Chief Health Officer telling us to wash our hands to locking the entire country down on the Friday. So, yet again, it's a fair point, but I don't see what it's got to do with solving the problem. And in the end, once I found my feet, I have pushed back.
Well, thanks for that. And look, I don't want to spend any more time looking back. What I'm interested in is where we are now and what we need to do to go forward, because I think there are some really, really big decisions that we should be talking about and policies we should be talking about to lay the foundation for the next 5 to 10 years for Australia. At the moment, my concern is that we seem to have got ourselves in this doom loop where we're just going over the same ground and put the same policies and the same strategies again and again and expecting a different outcome. And yet we've got this debt mountain. And so the fundamental question is, we know how we dug a hole, and we've covered that, but how do we get out of the hole, right? And there seems to me that it's fascinating that there are two completely different options to go out of the hole, but they can't both be correct. That's what I'm struggling with.
Sure, Martin. But the key question, if I can just make this one point, is why did they do the stimulus in March 2020? Because when we went through the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, there was no stimulus package. I mean, this stimulus package that was passed by the federal parliament, but obviously with the state parliaments and their stimulus packages, and then with the response of the RBA, this is the largest stimulus package in Australian history. It dwarfs what Rudd did in GFC, and obviously the reason why we have runaway inflation now is because of what happened in this critical period of 2020. So the question is, why did it happen, and why didn't we do record stimulus during the Spanish flu? And obviously, from a scientific point of view, the Spanish flu is obviously much more dangerous than what COVID has ever been. So and Martin, you and I covered this at the time. Is that you and I were warning about the household debt bubble and the foreign debt bubble that was at chronic levels in 2019, and so. Even if we didn't lock down, the downturn in the global economy and the impact that would have on gross domestic product in Australia, that would have been enough to potentially tip the banks over. So, because obviously the whole purpose of the stimulus, so with the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and one of the points I'll just quickly make is that in July of 2020. Senator Rennick went on Sky News and boasted that the Morrison package was generous, whereas I thought it was very wasteful. But the whole purpose of Keeper, Seeker, all these other measures and the interest rate cuts and the QE, it was all to ensure that households had enough cash flow to meet their mortgage repayments. Because if they didn't, and you started to see delinquencies and defaults, the banks would have gone. And so the stimulus was a conspiracy by Morrison, Frydenberg, the RBA, APRA, and the banks to keep the financial system going, to keep the bubble going. And so the reason why that's so important is that when we get to the solution, we need to understand that the bureaucrats that Senator Rennick has been going head-to-head with in some of these Senate estimate hearings, their job and their mindset is to keep the show going, to keep the bubble going. And so while you while you're trapped in this vortex of we can't do anything, otherwise we're going to result in a catastrophic depression. The only policies you can push is to perpetuate the debt bubble, and that's what the stimulus package was all about. So, in order to break free of this perpetual printing of money stimulus cycle, you've got to bring the debt bubble to an end. Now, Senator Rennick said it's something very important from an economic point of view, which is categorically false. He said all money is printed. Categorically false. For 5,000 years, gold and silver has been the money that has been the standard in which commerce and economies have been able to operate throughout all human civilizations, irrespective of geography or race, whatever. So there's a couple of important examples that Senator Rennick gave. So let me give you an example. Senator Rennick, and he's made this on multiple occasions about Governor Macquarie and what he did with the holy dollar. Now, Senator Rennick is right that prior to 1813, when Governor Macquarie arrived in Sydney, we did have a barter system, but we also did have a currency, and the currency was alcohol. And obviously, the alcohol that wasn't a very effective use in terms of a monetary system. So when Governor Macquarie introduced the holy dollar, what was that? It was a silver standard. So he bought 40,000 Spanish dollars, which was silver, punched a hole in them, and basically used the outer ring of the coin and then the inner ring to basically transfer the whole Sydney economy from alcohol to silver. And the way he was able to get alcohol out of the economic system was he created so much alcohol that the alcohol became worthless. And so that's what happens in hyperinflation. When you print too much of a fiat currency, the currency loses its value. Well, that's what Macquarie did with alcohol. He hyperinflated the supply of alcohol in Sydney, got everyone drunk, everyone stopped using alcohol, and then they used silver. Now, in the case of, for example, because Senator Rennick has mentioned this in the past about Alexander Hamilton and the first Bank of the United States, and again, this was a government. This was not a central bank in the context of what we understand the central bank to be today. But Alexander Hamilton, when he was the Treasury Secretary under George Washington, what they constructed was effectively a government bank that would basically handle all the government's finances. It would also deal with the United States, the creditors of the United States, which were mainly European creditors. But it also basically did finance infrastructure development, and I'm happy to have the discussion with Senator Rennick about infrastructure development. But the credit that was issued by the Bank of the United States that Hamilton created was backed by gold. And so the two classic examples that Senator Rennick has made in his maiden speech, but also in various interviews, is Macquarie and Hamilton. One had a silver standard, one had a gold standard, and yet where we are today is we have a fiat system. We have a fiat system that has no commodity backing at all. And so when you don't have, so the reason why this is important is that when you have a monetary system that's based on gold and silver, you can't print to infinity because you cannot manufacture gold and silver faster than in terms of what you can mine it. So there's a limit to how much you can expand the money supply. Whereas when there's a fiat system like we do now, both in terms of physical cash but digital currency, you can print it to infinity. And that's what the RBA did. So the whole premise that all money is printed is categorically false. And so because we don't have a hard currency monetary system, we have this huge debt bubble. We have this out of control inflation. We have rental stress at 60%, mortgage stress at 45%, according to our data market. And again, the question is, how do we get this under control? You have to shrink the debt. There is no, and again, in 2019, even before Senator Rennick became a senator, I had a meeting with the former member for Bennelong, John Alexander, and one of his colleagues who's still in Parliament, and they asked me about this in terms of what do we do with the debt. And at that time, it was private sector debt, and now we obviously have private sector, but also public sector debt. And I said to John Alexander and Russell Broadbent, I said to them, if you think you can wake up one morning and just click your fingers and just imagine or wish away the debt, you're living in a fantasy. The debt is here. It's out of control. The RBA, because they are because they basically are trying to prop up the big four banks, they have to keep creating more and more debt to keep the banks alive. Otherwise, we're going to have a financial crisis. And so, Martin, you and I did a show, I think, back in August of 2022, and the title of the show was "Explosive Conversations in Parliament." Well, one of the explosive conversations I had was with Angus Taylor, the current Shadow Treasurer, to Senator Rennick. And so, in that conversation, and here's the thing: so when Senator Rennick says, "Why are we raising interest rates?" Angus Taylor knows, because he told me to my face, that the only way to get inflation under control is to get the nominal interest rate above the inflation rate. So this is what they call the Taylor rule. Now, it's not the Taylor rule because of Angus Taylor, but there's a US economist by the same surname who came up with that. So that's how we got inflation under control in the late 70s. That's how we have to get inflation under control today. You have to get interest rates up to a high enough level to bring down the rate of inflation. And I said to Angus Taylor at that point, I said, even before you write your policies for the 2025 election, I know what you're going to write. I told him the Shadow Treasurer to his face, you don't have the guts to push the button. You don't have the guts to shrink the debt, because shrinking the debt means depression. It means significant unemployment. It means a complete economic reset. And there is no one in Parliament who has the guts to say to the Australian people, we have to go through significant real pain to bring the economy into some sort of fundamental order. And so, Martin, you and I have made the point on multiple occasions, according to Professor Steve Keen, we need to shrink household debt by about 2/3 in order to make the debt sustainable. And what that means is, as you keep on raising interest rates, you're going to realize that many of these mortgages that were written in 2020, 2021, and 2022 are completely uneconomical. And you basically have to take out all those toxic mortgages out of the bank. And then you've got to basically, deal with them in some form if you're going to have a sustainable banking sector. But even if you call, and then even if we start to look at public sector debt now, and here's where, again, I'm a commentator outside of Parliament. Senator Rennick is a member of the Senate, so he's actually in the system. So when we talk about out of control public sector debt, which was basically created, because remember, before COVID-19 in financial year 1920, the Morrison government, according to their own numbers, was on track for a surplus. And now we're basically, in terms of the federal government, we're looking at $1.1 trillion of gross federal government debt by 2026. How do you get that under control? You have to cut spending. And Senator Rennick may want to talk about growth. And I don't discount the importance of economic growth and whether it's financing infrastructure, etc. But there was a person in modern political history who tried to play this fantasy that you can balance the budget through growth, and in terms of tax cuts, and that was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was supposedly the biggest conservative. He dramatically cut taxes in the early 80s. And said that through cutting taxes, and this is the Laffer curve theory, that by cutting taxes and generating economic growth, we're going to balance the books. Well, Reagan was in power for 8 years. He had 8 deficits. And so if we're going to get public sector debt under control, we have to cut spending. And so, for example, if we look at where Labor's budget that Chalmers delivered in October, the current deficit for this financial year, 2022-23, is $36.9 billion. So to balance the books, you've got to cut $37 billion in this financial year. And then obviously because the RBA is broke, because they're insolvent, because all of these bonds that they bought, all the bonds they bought through the QE program have gone bad. You basically have, the only way to restore health of the RBA is you have to basically produce a large enough surplus that then you can go into the RBA and start buying these. You've got to start buying the bonds from the RBA, and then trying to assist them in trying to restore their balance sheet. That's the only responsible way. The only way to reverse QE is to, and this is what the United States did after World War II, was that they ran a series of surpluses over a decade, and then they basically went back to the US Federal Reserve and bought all the bonds, and then they were able to shrink the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve. So we have to get back to surplus. We have to get back to surplus as quickly as possible. Labor has delivered a budget the same as Frydenberg with 4 years of deficits. And the question is, where are the cuts going to come from? So 75% of federal spending is welfare, health, and education. that's where you've got to cut. And the question is, does Senator Rennick have the guts to say to the Australian people, we have to dramatically cut spending, abolish NDIS, dramatically, for example, raise the pension age, dramatically cut in terms of Medicare services, and all of these other bureaucracies, if we're going to cut, $37 billion just to balance the books, but we need actually a large surplus to actually start shrinking the balance sheet of the RBA. So we probably need to cut about $60 to $80 billion per year starting today. And the question is where are those cuts going to come from? Well, I know where I would cut. I have the guts to say to the Australian people that we have to make the hard decisions and all the things that people expect. We have to reset expectations, because one of the biggest problems that Australians have had for at least two to three decades is people believe that our living standards today, we are entitled to this. Now, what we need to understand is that we have our gross foreign debt is $2.9 trillion. We have racked up the international credit card for 3 decades. We've lived beyond our means, and there has to be someone in the political system who has to say to the Australian people, we've been sold a lemon for 3 decades, and now we actually have to go through the hard medicine if we're going to try to fix the problem. Because unfortunately, the actions of Senator Rennick and all of his colleagues in 2020 has bankrupted my children and probably my grandchildren, and it's going to take the most dramatic and draconian economic policies in Australian history to turn the ship around.
Yeah, John, I know that's very strongly your position. Senator, I'd like you to come back in at this point. The fundamental question I've got is this, that if in fact the answer is you've got to actually cut spending and essentially, whittle it down, that is obviously a difficult path. But if you go back to the public bank and the Commonwealth Bank, as it was previously, that actually was a way of creating sufficient momentum in the economy to be able to grow the economy to deal with the debt. I'm just wondering whether that is an alternative, and is that perhaps, Senator, more in line with your perspective as to where we should be focusing?
I missed that last little bit, Martin, but I'll just, in terms of cutting spending, I'm not against cutting spending in the right areas, but we need to be smart about how we do it, because, unlike John, I actually care about people and, don't want to spend my nights attacking individuals for the sake of inflating my own ego. And, the reality is there's a reason why, I'm where I am and John's sitting there, the faceless man, is because you've got to be able to relate to people and give hope to them and empower them. And John isn't interested in empowering people. He is interested in tearing them down for the sake of winning an argument on a blog on a Tuesday night. And that sort of attitude won't get the country anywhere. But yes, look, in terms of spending, the very first thing I said in my maiden speech after the introduction was that there is nothing more damaging to this country than the fiscal imbalance and the ambiguous responsibilities between state and federal governments. And I highlighted the health system, where we have 9 health bureaucracies, whilst, my hometown and many other small towns and even big towns like Gladstone are losing our maternity wards. So by all means, let's cut spending when it comes to bureaucracy. If we want to look for money, I'm out there on the record as saying I think we should cut the tax rate, lift the tax-free threshold to $40,000. I think it's completely absurd that we tax people below the cost of living. I want to make sure that people can keep their superannuation. If we got rid of superannuation, that's $50 billion in tax breaks we could park in the budget and return to the battlers. 13 million workers in this country, $50 billion. That's works out at $3,000 each. That would be a way, to give income tax cuts and let people keep their own hard-earned wages. So on top of the $3,000 in tax cuts, they'd get to keep their own superannuation. And if they spent that money, you'd have a high velocity of money throughout the system. And of course, this is what John hasn't discussed. He calls himself an economist, but all he can talk about is austerity, and not velocity and productivity. And if we go, and the other thing, and I'm happy to put this on record, I've already told the Australian Financial Review about it, John Kehoe, is that we should have a capital gains tax on houses above $2 million. Effectively, I fail to see why hardworking Australians have to pay tax above $18,200 a year when they earn that through their hard labour. And yet we've got these, wealthy people living in the inner suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne virtue signalling away but making hundreds of thousands of dollars in wealth every year, unrealised wealth, a lot of it, but they're getting wealthy at the expense of hardworking battlers. So your two biggest costs to the budget in terms of foregone tax revenue is superannuation and capital gains tax on housing. And all of that money should then be returned to hardworking people, as should any childcare payments. That should go back to families as well and let them choose how they want to spend the money. And that might mean that one of the parents actually gets to stay at home and get more involved with school life, which will help weed out the Marxism that's coming up through our school system. And so I've got, I think there's ways to do this without punishing people through no fault of their own. I mean, effectively what John wants to do is effectively punish people for decisions that weren't made by them. And I accept this is a political problem. It's been made by inept politicians who have allowed themselves to be hoodwinked by not just neoliberal philosophies, but, let's throw in Marxism and communism when it comes to superannuation. Look, by all means, tackle spending where we should, but we should never cut frontline services, and I want to be very clear about that. If anything, actually, I think we need to increase frontline services, and I have no problem in saying that because I know our teachers and our nurses and our police spend most of their money. They're not on huge dollars, and if we've got a healthier, safer community, we'll have a more productive economy.
And Senator, one question that I was wanting to pursue a little bit here. The RBA clearly had a significant role through COVID, taking interest rates ultra low. They did the term funding facility. They're paying significant money to the banks now, the difference between 0.1% and the current interest rate. So is the RBA part of the problem or part of the solution?
No, part of the problem. Get rid of them, bring it back in the control of basically the executive / parliament. I'm not against having an RBA, but it should be accountable. And the only way you're going to be accountable, and I say that for a lot of these independent statutory bodies, they should not be independent. That's doublespeak, Orwellian doublespeak for unaccountable and not transparent. I actually asked the RBA for correspondence between it and the Bank of International Settlements for the last decade, and they wouldn't give it to me. And Michelle Bullock admitted to me that if she gave it to me in estimates, that they'd no longer have a seat at the table. I mean, what does that tell you? That tells you that the RBA is nothing but a puppet for the puppet masters, the faceless men at the Bank of International Settlements and the Federal Reserve. I mean, we just can't have this. I mean, that's just absurd that, the RBA won't disclose correspondence body to an elected representative of the people.
And of course...
But it shows, I mean, I was always going to be no when I asked that question.
Yeah. Oh, you're frozen. Hope you come back in a second. John, you sent you to come back. Yeah, so the RBA part of the problem, you'd agree with that?
Of course. I mean, yes. So when we're talking about the heart of why we have the financial and economic problems that we have, a lot of it is because we got off the hard money standard. I mean, the world was on the world was on effectively a gold standard up until 1971 when the Richard Nixon closed the gold window, and ever since then we've had runaway money printing that's built up the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world. And so, here's the thing. So we are, just to place this in the broader context, Martin, is that Australia has the biggest debt bubble in the history. At the same time, we've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world. I mean, that is not a hyperbole. That's no exaggeration. That is a statistical fact. Humanity, as a human species, we have never been in this position before. So obviously, the monetary system, what the RBA has done, taking interest rates from, say, 15.5% in the 91 recession all the way down to 0.1. Not only that, but obviously the policies of APRA and the commercial banks, that has been a huge issue. But Martin, can I just say this, because Senator Rennick said something very interesting about my morality and whether I'm heartless or not. There is no more bigger moral dilemma in terms of economics than in terms of inflation. So between the Austrian school, if I could put it, and then you've got the Keynesians and the socialists, there's always this big debate: what is more evil? What is more painful for people? Is it inflation or is it actually unemployment? I mean, if you start to talk to now we know from in terms of various economics and psychological studies, people feel unemployment more harder. But again, inflation is an absolute killer. So the reason why I want to take the policies that I want to take is because I understand the impact that inflation has on ordinary people, and I am completely against those things. So my moral position is not that I'm heartless. It is because I've read, numerous books about economics of history, and I understand what happens when you get out of control inflation that could potentially lead into hyperinflation. So we have to get the inflation under control. But also, can I say that if you listen to Senator Renner carefully, he talked about cuts, but he won't give us specific figures and specific actual programs where the cut's going to be. And because he talked about cutting bureaucracy, and I'm all for that. I'm all for shutting down various agencies. But if you think you're going to cut $37 billion in federal spending just by sucking a few bureaucrats, that's not going to cut it. You have to cut programs. You have to cut them deeply, and you have to level with the public in terms of. You have to level the public in terms of trying to resolve these issues. So, and obviously in terms of the RBA, I think in my last debate with Robbie Barwick, I was very crystal clear about this. Is that if I was Prime Minister tonight, within the first hour, I would end central bank independence. I would call a meeting of the RBA. I would dramatically raise interest rates and pop the bubble immediately, because the faster you do it, and the faster you do it, and the more sooner you do it, the sooner you can get to a problem, the sooner you can get to a solution and a more sustainable economy. So I have no hesitation. I mean, and again, so the other thing I just wanted to say is that there's been only one person in federal political history who had the guts to make the right decision, and that was Joseph Lyons. He won the largest victory in Australian federal politics in 1931, 58.5 2PP. It was bigger than Rudd or bigger than Fraser or bigger than Curtin in 1943. The one person who had the guts, who basically stood on principle, was willing to quit the Labor cabinet, willing to quit the Labor Party after a whole career in Labor, said we're not going to follow the mistakes of the Weimar Republic in Germany, and he basically was willing to implement austerity in order to save the Australian economy from a catastrophic financial crisis. And yes, unemployment went to 32%, the second highest behind Germany. But there were other policies playing a role in that. But we went into a deep depression in the Great Depression. But we came out of it relatively quickly, and we were able to be on a sustainable basis. And the performance of the Australian economy in the 1930s was far superior than the United States in terms of FDR. So if people want to go through history and say, well, based on empirical evidence, because Senator Renner loves to talk about empirical evidence when it comes to climate change and a whole host of other topics. But when we look at the empirical evidence of economics, what was the right policy suite that worked? Well, we have a domestic example in the 1930s, and we shouldn't shy away from telling the public the truth that we have to shrink the debt bubble, and shrinking the debt bubble comes at significant short-term pain. But if we care about our children and our grandchildren, and I've got 3 kids myself, we have to make the right decision today.
Okay, John, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Senator, let me come back to you. Clearly, the question here is how much debt is too much debt. But I just wanted to highlight the issue again. I sort of tried to get the conversation earlier. We didn't quite manage it. If you look at what happened with the public bank earlier in history, that was a way of investing in infrastructure and creating growth and momentum that actually grew the economy and was able to actually tackle the debt that way. Do you think there's merit in that approach now?
Oh, absolutely. Have you got me there, Mark?
Yeah, you froze a bit. I hope then you came back. So have another go. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, absolutely. And John keeps saying we've got to shrink the debt, and yet he wants to increase interest rate. If you've got $1 million in debt, you've got an interest rate of 10%. That's $100,000 added to the bill every year. You're not going to shrink the debt by increasing interest rates too fast. beyond productivity growth, right? So, and he talks about, job losses and not losing jobs. If he jacks up interest rates, and I well remember this because I was a graduate in Paul Keating's recession, 1990 recession, I well remember the large unemployment rate. I think it got as high as 11.9% or 12% in 1990 because interest rates were too high. So for John to sit there and say, oh, well, I wanted to save jobs, you're not going to save jobs by jacking up interest rates and imposing austerity on the people. You're actually going to lose jobs. And I'm happy to name, like I've said, have one federal, in terms of where the savings are, I would have one federal health bureaucracy that then basically, go back to what we now have in Queensland, for example. We have Metro North, Metro South, we have Darling Downs in the southwest, we have various hospital levels, and I would let the hospitals run those boards, and Metro North and Metro South in Brisbane, for example, I would let them run the system. They don't need the state government in the way, right? Because in my view, health is very inelastic. If I'm bitten by a snake in the middle of the paddock somewhere out in the farm, I'm not going to sit on the phone looking for the cheapest quotes across the country to get flown to whatever the cheapest hospital is. I want, all right. So when it comes to health, it's very inelastic. We've just got to provide good services as efficiently as possible. On the other hand, I would push education back down into super regionals, similar to Metro North, Metro South, where I would have a competitive health, education system. Likewise with energy, I would let each region decide what energy they want. I'm happy to, but long story short, I do not want two layers of bureaucracy at both state and federal, and in many cases, also at the council level as well. So, let's start with the bureaucracy first, foremost. And I think you'll find if you get rid of a lot of these bureaucracies, a lot of that wasteful spending will go because they look for ways to create, to spend money. But back to your initial, your most recent question, Martin. Productivity rather than austerity. So by all means, let's build. Let's use an infrastructure bank, and an infrastructure bank is the same as a company when they issue new shares. It's all we're doing is we're investing in the untapped wealth of this country. John, yet again was playing silly buggers before. He's right. I mean, I was aware of the gold and silver prior to, around the 1700s, 1800s when paper currency came in. But in recent history, modern history, most money has been printed. And albeit, most of the time it was backed by silver or gold. And we definitely need a hard asset. It definitely needs to be backed by a hard asset, preferably not oil, because that's obviously resulted in, the Iraq war, with the US not wanting Saddam to receive payments in euro. That euro currency has actually, I was thinking about it the other night. I think that's behind a lot of the aggression of some of the, wars in the 21st century. It's been about protecting the hard asset that backs that US dollar, or I like to call it the deep state dollar, because, I don't want to take it out on the US people. It's not their fault what the swamp in Washington's up to. But I digress. There's been plenty of examples of governments building infrastructure and where that's been a productive measure. And, look, to summarise, give me productivity over any day, empowering the individual rather than centralised decision-making, austerity measures and unaccountability by bureaucrats who think they can just destroy the economy, destroy people's lives and then get away with it.
Now, let me come up on there because, of course, the Federal Reserve recently published a report that said we need more monetary policy tools, and so the central bank digital currency is now seen as another suite of tools that will allow them to control the economy and use their tools to better control monetary policy. What you just said about we don't need more bureaucracy, we need less bureaucracy. Is a central bank digital currency another example of going in the wrong direction?
I don't like digital currencies. I fear that they're going to be used, and I don't like the use of the word currency either because, that is a stepping stone towards a social credit system. I hate to impute motive, and I'm doing it again, but it does worry me. I'm just not a fan of digital currency. I want to see something tangible. It's got to be backed by something tangible. In some respects with bank accounts, if it was a genuine currency and it was going to stay that way, because in many respects, we get debited, $5,000 to our account each week for work. So in many respects, that's digital, right? But it's got to be some sort of form. Whatever the currency we use is, there's got to be some sort of hard currency behind it, and it's got to be convertible into cash if necessary. Not that I know a lot of people think cash is king. I actually think that's true to an extent, but hard assets are actually trump cash. In the long run, because the government can always pull cash as well, and if the country collapses, your cash is worthless as well. I mean, having said that, even your land and assets can, other than gold and jewellery that you might be able to hide if you can, flee the country, you might be able to keep those assets. But the key thing to maintaining your wealth is having a peaceful and prosperous country that provides stability. So your wealth and that title doesn't get lost in the overthrow of a new country.
Just taking it slightly further, one other question, which I'll get John to come in a second. There's a lot of top-down direction and suggestion from the World Economic Forum and from other international bodies, the IMF, whether it's a central bank digital currency. To what extent do you think that policy is being reined top-down into local parliaments around the world and local decision-making fora, rather than actually being driven from the local community and, if you like, bottom up? Because to me, that's part of this really big problem.
You just nailed it there, Martin. Absolutely. That's exactly right. And it's the complete antithesis of I keep coming back to the 1776 Revolutionary War, but that was where the world was turned upside down on its head, because the Patriots said, we're not going to take orders top down anymore. All men are created equal, and democracy is based on grassroots participation. And that was, I know it was coming. There's been forms of it in Britain before that, some sort of democratic structure. It wasn't that democratic; it was still pretty much wealth driven. But that is the problem in a nutshell today. That everything is top down. We live in this sort of matrix where we're led to believe that we live in a democracy, and that you have a vote every 3 years, and that people listen politics. They listen to the people. Politicians listen to the people. They don't. Politicians listen to bureaucrats. I think right now there's some health conference going on over the World Health Organization where there's discussions over these international health regulations. I don't know if the Health Minister, Mark Butler's over there, but I can assure you there'll be a whole battalion of bureaucrats over there that will come back and make recommendations to the Minister's department about this is what we should do, yada, yada, yada. And the influence of those bureaucrats will probably, have the greatest say. I mean, I know that I've had many meetings with Josh in my time, and, you could always see the pull of Treasury had a lot of influence over the Treasury. It wasn't just Josh, it was all treasurers. Whenever I hear anyone say we've always relied on foreign capital and so forth. Have you got me there, Martin? I keep dropping out a bit. You still got me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, look, in a nutshell, I'll answer this, is that it's probably 95% top down, and, the occasional marginal swinging seat, that member, because he might be in threat of losing his seat and the government of the day, might lose government, they might start, that's when they'll start listening. But until then, the system is very much designed to weed out independent thinkers. And that's the way our system works. We've got 151 lower house seats in the country, before, let's say generalisation here, but about 60 are safe Labor, 60 are safe coalition. So 120 members out of that 150, and you can argue a few numbers here or there, they are on a career trajectory upwards. They want to become a part of that executive, and they will say very little as backbenchers so that they can get promoted and become ministers. So they basically have their silence brought out, and it's really and if you do speak up, you quickly have to pile on by the media, by the opposition, even sometimes by your own colleagues. So the counter.
Yeah, you just froze there for a second, just at the end. Yeah, just say the last sentence again. You froze just at the end there.
Yeah. So the system is very much designed to weed out people who are independent thinkers and will often put forward a counter narrative.
Thank you. So, John, question to you, top down. How much of this is being dictated by bureaucrats internationally versus decisions taken locally?
Sure. Happy to answer that question, Martin.
Could you answer that? Would be good.
Yeah, but the thing is that can I just address a couple of points that Senator Rennick made? So because Senator Rennick was made the point of how do you actually get the debt to shrink? Because obviously, I mean, in terms of the heart of what I believe is the solution, and just coming to the question you just posed of where the decision is coming from is that because we have a financial system that is so interdependent with its globally systemically important banks, etc., is that the policies coming from Basel for the Bank of International Settlements and all the other major central banks is they all need to keep the debt bubble going, because if there's a financial crisis in one country and that starts to spread throughout the financial system, that could endanger the financial system right across the world. And so the IMF has said that if our big four banks were to go simultaneously, that is enough to bring the entire financial system to its needs. So Australia has, and I think I made this point when I debated Robbie Barwick, is that we have the power to change the course of history by collapsing the big four banks. And obviously, if we raise the interest rates to a high level, that's what we're going to do, and we can basically reverse all of these international decisions that are being driven by the World Economic Forum and in terms of the whole other thing. And so yes, so the question is, who's running the country? It is these bureaucrats who are listening to these overseas people. And part of one of the things I will say is one of the reasons why we do have this review into the RBA was because there's effectively a revolt within the RBA where you had an official who resigned, who basically wrote an email to internally in the RBA, which was released on FOI, criticising the entire bank, criticising the board, criticising the governor, because what this official basically said was that the governor wasn't listening to the bank's internal research. But who is the RBA governor, Philip Lowe, listening to? He's listening to the other central banks. And why? Because the debt bubble is so interdependent, and you've got to try to keep this debt bubble financial system, which is so fundamentally shaky, and I mean you've got to keep it going. But the question that the point that Senator Rennick made earlier is that how do you get the debt to shrink if you raise interest rates? Well, if you raise interest rates to such a high level, what you're trying to engender is defaults. So the more people that default to the point that you do see a bank go, that's when the debt's going to shrink, because there is less debt and less credit in the system. So by raising interest rates, the whole point of my strategy is to force people to default on the debts, and by having defaults and going into a financial crisis and then into a depression, you're going to basically shrink the debt. Now, in terms of productivity, which is something that Senator Rennick said is part of the solution, I wholeheartedly agree. We have to be a productive country, but we also have to keep in mind that when we think about economics, there's a central objective as an economy we have to achieve. We have to make products that people want to buy at a price that people are willing to pay for. And so, unfortunately, other than commodities, we're not making anything that people want around the world. And we're not producing things at a particular price. Look at in terms of a competitive price, and so by embracing deflation, we're going to drive prices right throughout the economy. But also, can I say, Martin, is that what the debt bubble does is actually it distorts economic resources and it creates all sorts of inefficiencies. So, for example, let me give you one example. Because we have the biggest property bubble in Australian history, we have tens of thousands of tradies in the construction sector. And the only reason why they have jobs is because of the monetary policies that the RBA has been pursuing, but also all of these favourable property policies that state and federal governments have been pursuing as well. So if you were to pop the debt bubble and you were able to basically dramatically shrink property prices to something that is more fundamentally sustainable, all of these tradies who are working on either building new houses or doing renovations, etc., they would be needing to go and work in a different sector. And so if you have all these people who leave one sector and you were able to retrain them, well, then you would be able to have enough labor that we could actually have a competitive manufacturing sector. So if we're going to revive manufacturing, I think if Senator Rennick can correct me on this, I think Senator Rennick wants a renaissance of manufacturing. I want a renaissance of manufacturing, but what we need to be able to do is that we need to be cost competitive, and we need to be able to produce goods and services that particularly the Asian market want at prices they're willing to pay for. And that means that, yes, we have to be smarter. We have to use technology. We have to use all the intellectual know-how that we have in this country, but we have to be a lot cheaper. And obviously a lot cheaper, when we have runaway inflation, that creates a really big problem in terms of being internationally competitive. So the whole idea of shrinking the debt bubble, reallocating resources, and resetting the economy, it is in the end. Now, again, these are short-term measures, but in the end, it is to take us to where Senator Rennick wants to go, which is a productive and efficient economy that is creating wealth. I think Senator Rennick and I want the end result, but one's based on economic history, and then obviously Senator Rennick his own interpretation in terms of how to potentially, in terms of how to get to the end game. But in terms of, but while we completely live in this fantasy that there's no debt bubble and everything's okay, well, obviously the bureaucrats like Philip Lowe, rather than listening to his own researchers at the bank, is listening to Basel and London and Washington and all these other central banks, and we've lost complete control in terms of domestic policy. So all of these bureaucrats are basically working in an international conspiracy to keep the debt bubble going. And while we pretend that we don't have to deal with this bubble, we're not going to be able to reclaim sovereignty, but also our political and civil rights. And that's why I think taking the economy through a depression, which is what Joseph Lyons did in 1931, is the right solution, both politically, economically, morally, socially, in terms of civil rights as well. And if we do all these things and we free ourselves of being so interconnected with the financial system, we don't have to listen to these international bureaucrats who are telling us what to do, and we'll be able to dictate our own path going forward. And we can, be a free and independent sovereign nation, and the Australian people can dictate what Australia wants to be in the future.
Thank you, John. I want to do two things because we're close to the end of the show. Firstly, there was this question that came in earlier on, which I think is actually quite a good way to bring this out. And thanks for the super chat there. Any thoughts on a fair and equitable solution for all Australians to get out what appears to be a mess currently, in which the government simply kicks the can down the road? So that the point there is, all Australians, and Senator, can I come to you first? How do we embrace the all Australia bit?
Well, the all Australia bit is to try and keep people in their jobs, and where we do need to make cost savings, for example, so saying that in the bureaucracy, is that we shift people from non-productive jobs into productive jobs, and that's the best way to deal with transitioning our economy, is by, as I said, this infrastructure bank that set about building things. That will require labour, and that labour will come from our battalions of financial engineers, battalions of academics, battalions of gambling machine operators, and get those people out of those non-productive jobs and into productive jobs that are going to generate a recurring form of income way into the future. That to me is the best. Is the best way to do it. Is to ensure that people don't lose their jobs, and also don't. The other, all Australians, is that people were told interest rates weren't going to go up, or implied, until 2024. So it's not fair to jack interest rates up too fast on those people. So yet again, it's the same. It's the same answer most to most of these problems, is that we've just got to get productive and start building.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So what I want to do is allow just sort of a summation from each. John, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to sum up your position, and then I'll come back to the Senator, and then we'll close the show at that point. So, John, over to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Senator, for participating in this lively debate. It has been quite enjoyable. But, if we're going to get to the crux of the issue, is that there is no equitable solution. There is no solution that does not involve pain. And so while, and maybe Senator Rennick will say that I have the luxury of telling the truth because I'm not an elected official, whereas when you are a victim of democracy in a parliamentary system, you basically have to tell people what they want to hear. So, from Wollongong, we tend to be more frank than perhaps than the people from Chinchilla. So here in Wollongong, if we're going to give the honest and direct truth and tell people how to get out of this, there will be pain. There has to be pain. If you look through every economic situation throughout the course of human history, which is 6,000 years of recorded history, there has never been a solution without pain. And so there is no equitable solution. Some people will suffer more than others. But the question is, how much pain and how quickly can you get to a viable solution? The only way to do it is the old analogy of, if you have a Band-Aid on your knee or your elbow, do you take the band off slowly or do you rip it off very quickly? And so the faster we get to the correct economic solution, the faster we can get to the economic nirvana that we want to get to. But in summary, my position is we have the biggest debt bubble in Australian history. There is no fantasy solution. We have to make hard decisions. We have to tell the public the truth that they don't want to hear. And if we don't, mark my words, Martin and Senator Rennick, we are repeating the mistakes of the Weimar Republic. And when you have runaway inflation and an out of control public sector and a social culture, you create the conditions for extremism, and that's what happened in Germany with the rise of Hitler. So we are, as we go through forward to 2030, if we don't come to grips with actually bring this economy into some semblance of order, not only will the ongoing economic pain that will happen, because can I just say this, because again, going back to my morality, people are suffering today. People are suffering today in 2023 because of the decisions of the Parliament in 2020 in terms of this record stimulus package. So there is pain today, and under Senator Rennick's policies, that pain will continue with this record mortgage and rental stress. So the only way to get this stress under control is to get the inflation under control, and the only way to do that is through some form of, or in terms of austerity, and so that's how we have to get to fixing the problem. I've been saying it publicly since 2016. I'll continue to say today. The Parliament and the bureaucrats don't want to face the demons this country is going to face, and that's why I continue. Look, even though I want a depression, even though I know it's the right solution, the likely scenario is we will have stagflation, ongoing cost of living pressures under Albanese. It's going to get worse under the current government, and whenever the next recession or financial crisis comes about, the RBA is going to double down and print even more. And that's when we could easily see some form of hyperinflation, and God help us if that happens.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And Senator, across to you for your closing remarks.
Thanks for having me on tonight, Martin, and thanks to all your listeners for bearing with us for an hour and a half. That's been a long time, given a lot of it's from John, and he's very much a dry economic rationalist. And I have to say, economists are to the finance industry what climate scientists are to scientists. They basically live off modelling, in these theoretical ideas. But in the real world, we need to build. And I don't know if there'd be economists out there would actually know how to build something that could actually build infrastructure or something productive, and not an actual model. So. look, I think I've said everything I've needed to say tonight. We need to be productive. I'm totally against the austerity measures of the RBA and raising interest rates too quickly. Not saying that we shouldn't raise interest rates, but we really need to look at quantitative easing in a productive manner. We do need a more efficient form of government, so we need to get rid of 2 layers of bureaucracy in this country. We are clearly overgoverned, and we need to basically empower the individual. I mean, I think if we're going to get out of this, and I'll speak about building our way out of this, but we also need to rebuild the individual and empower the individual to give them the strength and the confidence to know that they can get on with their life without the government in it. Because, I know I speak to many people up here in Queensland. I know the police force morale is very low here. There's record numbers of police leaving here in Queensland, in Victoria and WA. I know the nurses have got very low morale. And this is a symptom of, and just people everywhere, whether it's because of mandates, vaccine injuries, or other, government intervention, we need to get government out of people's lives. And, that will also help. I mean, I know that's maybe a little bit touchy-feely, but I know that putting economics aside, that is a real issue out there at the moment. And I think you nailed it before, Martin, when you said there is a very top-down approach in the world today, and we need to go back to 1776, or I know I always do, and find inspiration in those people that said, no, we'll decide, how our country's run, and we want to say in running it. And, we're not going to have unaccountable or unelected people either in Australia or offshore telling us how to live our lives. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks very much for having me on tonight.
Thank you, Senator. I really appreciate your time. I've had quite a few people in the chat saying, please get him on again. So I'll chat with you, see whether we can get you on, a little bit later, because I think there were some really important points there. I will make one point. One of the things that digital allows is actually much more participation from individuals. So in theory, the idea of democracy bottom up should be facilitated, enabled by digital. I mean, that seems to me an amazing opportunity that I'm not sure has been really thought through, right? So that's something else just to
it's been thought through all right, Martin. As I said to you earlier, just last week, we've had the White House, thanks to Elon Musk and the Twitter files, it now turns out that the White House has been censoring social media. So what you say is social media is an excellent way to empower the individual and give individual voices. However, we've got the big end of town, whether it's big government or big corporations or big media, who see this as a threat. And it's 1776 all over again, in the digital sense of the word, whereby, people who speak out or push forward a counter narrative are being censored. And we just cannot have that. And if we go back, I know I keep harping on this, but the First Amendment was the freedom of speech, And, we've now got, evidence, or it seems to me that Twitter files has revealed that Biden and his cronies in the White House are actually violating the First Amendment, and that is just absolutely unforgivable.
No, that's a very good point. Well, I think there's a really interesting conversation we can have another time about some of those broader demographic and democratic issues, because it's so critical. Thank you both very much. Really appreciate your time. I'm going to take you offline now, and then I'll close the show because we're way over time. But thank you both very much for your participation and your willingness to engage and take a bit of skin off each other as well. Thank you both.
Cheers. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. See ya. So there you go. Hope you found that interesting and educational. I certainly learned quite a lot tonight. And I want to say thank you to both parties for going in, boots and all. Just to say that next week, Robbie Barwick's coming on. We're going to talk about a public bank and how that's going to play out. And there's a whole campaign running about things like, for example, the question of regional banking and things. So join us with Robbie next week. And just to say finally that there is a poll running at the moment, so I'll be interested for you to vote in the poll. It's on the chat there. Who do you think won? Was it John? Was it the Senator, or was it a draw? And I can tell you that at the moment the results are that Senator Rennick is 33, John is 42, and 25 said a draw. I'll leave the poll open just a little bit longer for people to vote if they haven't done so, just to make it known. And finally, I will just show you the doggies. They're still there. They've been pretty much there the whole night. and I think they're out for the count. So I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. I hope you found some interesting points there. And, it's always interesting trying to facilitate these things by letting people have their head, but also trying to steer it a little bit. So I hope you felt we did a reasonable job of that too. So thank you very much. Take care. Have a good week. Check out our recorded shows over the next few days, and we'll be back next Tuesday with Robbie. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.